The sky over Blue Ridge was overcast with heavy clouds, signaling an approaching storm. A gentle wind carried the moisture of the impending rain. In that atmosphere, Richard Nelson stepped out of his old pickup truck, his sharp eyes scanning the parking lot of the police department, the place where, starting today, he would be in charge. No one recognized him. That was exactly what Richard wanted. No grand welcomes, no wary glances from those who knew they would be under his control. Just a black man, dressed simply a faded plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and frayed sneakers, walking into what was supposed to be a symbol of justice, but had, for years, been mired in whispers of discrimination and abuse of power. He took a deep breath, inhaling the damp scent of asphalt after the previous night's rain, then adjusted his baseball cap, pulling it lower over his face. Every one of his senses was on high alert, preparing to face the raw truth, a truth he needed to see with his own eyes before he could change it. Richard entered through the side door of the police station, where officers were beginning their workday. Phones rang, conversations buzzed, and footsteps echoed against the polished tile floor. Everything unfolded naturally, with no one paying attention to him, a stranger stepping into their world. But soon, that sense of normalcy would be disrupted. Richard didn't know exactly what he would encounter, but one thing was certain. This anonymous visit would reveal the true face of the place he was about to lead. And no matter what the outcome, he was ready to face it. Richard walked slowly down the hallway, silently observing the people he was about to lead. In the corner of the break room, a group of officers laughed and chatted casually. A little farther away, a young female officer typed briskly on her keyboard, occasionally frowning at her screen. Everyone was busy with their work. No one paid attention to the middle-aged man with a calm demeanor walking among them. But then, a cold voice cut through the air. "Hey, old man, what the hell are you doing here?" Richard stopped, his eyes meeting the man who had spoken, a young police officer with neatly trimmed blonde hair and pale blue eyes that gleamed with sharpness and arrogance. His name tag read, Daniels. The room seemed to tense. The chatter died down as several officers turned to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and amusement. Daniels lifted his chin, scanning Richard from head to toe. "We don't have room for vagrants here," he said, his voice hard and laced with contempt. "Get out before I throw you out myself." Richard remained still, not reacting immediately. He looked directly into Daniels' eyes as the officers around them watched with interest. None intervened, and no one looked surprised. It was as if this scene was all too familiar to them. Daniels smirked, and then, too, a cold glob of spit landed on Richard's face. The entire room fell silent. A few officers chuckled softly. Others simply crossed their arms and watched, waiting for a reaction from the homeless man who had just been humiliated. Daniels folded his arms, his eyes filled with challenge. For a brief moment, time seemed frozen. Richard clenched his fist slightly, feeling the hot blood rushing through his veins. But he did not lunge forward, did not yell, did not explode with rage as anyone else might have in this situation. Instead, he slowly pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and carefully wiped the filth from his face. His gaze never left Daniels, deep and unwavering, like the ocean before a storm. What Richard needed to know was now crystal clear. No more words were necessary. He had seen the true face of this place. And in that very moment, he knew his work, his mission, had begun. The atmosphere in the police station's meeting room had never been more lively. Officers gathered in small groups, chatting animatedly about the new leader they were about to meet. Speculation and rumors spread like wildfire. Some hoped for a strong leader, while others remained skeptical, unsure of what kind of change he would bring. At the front of the room, Captain Harris, a middle-aged man with a stern face, stood upright, gripping a folder tightly in his hands. He scanned the room before firmly announcing, "Attention, everyone. We have an important announcement." The chatter immediately died down. All eyes turned to the podium. Daniels, who had just had an unpleasant encounter with the homeless man earlier, stood with his arms crossed, smirking. To him, this was nothing worth caring about. Another new police chief? They came and went. Nothing ever changed. Harris took a deep breath before slowly declaring, "I would like to introduce our new chief of police, Mr. Richard Nelson." A sudden silence fell over the room. No one moved. Faces froze in disbelief. Eyes widened in shock. Daniels frowned, thinking he must have misheard. And then, in front of everyone, Richard Nelson stepped onto the podium. He was calm, composed, his gaze sweeping over each officer in the room. Some immediately straightened up, looking uneasy. The ones who had been laughing just moments ago had fallen completely silent. But the one most shaken was Daniels. His entire body went rigid. His breath felt heavy. His heart plummeted straight into his stomach. He stared at the man who had wiped spit off his face, the same man he had mercilessly humiliated. Chief Nelson stopped in front of the podium. A brief pause, then his eyes met Daniels'. His gaze was calm, yet piercingly cold. Daniels swallowed hard. Sweat began to form on his forehead. The officers around them slowly started to piece things together, and an overwhelming sense of discomfort spread through the room. No one dared to say a word. Richard Nelson stood there, like a storm on the verge of breaking. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried no anger, no fury, only a quiet strength that sent chills down every spine in the room. "We have a lot of work to do." And in that moment, everyone understood. The real storm had only just begun. The room remained engulfed in heavy silence. No one dared to utter a word. Eyes filled with confusion, shame, and even anger. But Richard Nelson paid no attention. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across each person. These were the people he would lead from this day forward. He stopped, took a deep breath, and spoke. "I did not come here today just to assume my position. I came to witness. And what I have seen I cannot accept." Some officers exchanged glances. A few lowered their heads, while others crossed their arms, displeased. But Nelson was unwavering. "I walked these hallways unnoticed. I saw firsthand how you treat your colleagues, the civilians, and even those you deem beneath you." His voice paused for a moment. Daniels felt each word cut into him like a blade. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck, but he did not dare to move. "I was humiliated in a place that should stand as a symbol of justice." The tension in the room tightened like a noose. Some officers straightened their backs, as if only now realizing the gravity of the situation. Richard Nelson raised a hand, pointing toward them, one by one. But the most shameful thing was not the actions of one individual. It was the silence of all of you. Now, discomfort had turned into sheer weight. Some officers averted their gazes. They understood exactly what he meant. Silence was complicity. This toxic culture ends today. From this moment forward, I will not tolerate disrespect, abuse of power, or discrimination of any kind. Nelson slammed his hand against the podium. The sharp sound made a few officers flinch. "I don't care what you've done before, but from now on, if anyone continues to dishonor the badge, they will have no place in this force." The air froze solid. Officers glanced at one another, some tense, some angry, some deep in thought. Nelson knew there would be resistance. Some would refuse to change. But he also knew there were those in this room who truly wanted change. He took a slow, steady breath, then delivered his final words with unwavering conviction. "Remember this from now on. All of you are being watched." The silence that followed was even heavier than before. But this time, it was no longer skepticism. It was fear. And it was the sign of the storm that was about to sweep through this police station. The atmosphere in the room remained thick after Richard Nelson's weighty speech. All eyes were on him, a strong, cold, but undeniably decisive man. But then, those eyes shifted to someone else. Daniels. The white officer, who had been smug and arrogant just minutes ago, now looked pale. His fists were clenched tightly, not out of anger, but out of fear. Richard stepped down from the podium and walked straight toward Daniels. The entire room fell silent, waiting for what would happen next. "Officer Daniels," Richard spoke slowly, his deep voice carrying immense pressure. "Do you have anything to say?" Daniels swallowed hard, standing as straight as possible, as if trying to hold on to the last shred of his dignity. "Chief, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't know who you were, and I—" Richard cut him off. "Exactly. You didn't know who I was. But that's not the problem." Daniels opened his mouth to say something, but Richard took another step closer, his gaze ice cold. "The problem isn't that you didn't recognize me. The problem is that you saw a man you assumed was homeless and immediately looked down on him." Daniels remained silent. Some officers in the room lowered their eyes, clearly uncomfortable. "You didn't just insult me," Richard continued, his voice slow but filled with authority. "You insulted the very uniform you wear. And the worst part is, he glanced around the room, his sharp eyes cutting through the silence. Not a single one of you spoke up. Daniels still tried to justify himself. I didn't mean it that way. I just thought. No, Daniels, Richard's voice hardened. You didn't think. You acted on instinct. And that instinct is the real problem. The room fell into silence once more. Daniels' mouth hung open, but no words came out. He knew he was wrong. But what terrified him even more was the fact that Richard Nelson was not the kind of man who would be swayed by empty excuses. Apathy is the most dangerous disease in this force, Richard said, turning to face the entire room. And I am here to cure it. Daniels clenched his fists, but he didn't dare fight back. He understood that from this moment on, everything had changed. And Richard? He had just begun his purge. Daniels stood frozen. His face was tense, his eyes flickering between anger, shame, and a hint of panic. But Richard Nelson didn't wait for his reaction. Officer Daniels. Richard's voice rang out, sharp as a blade slicing through the heavy air in the room. As of this moment, you are suspended indefinitely. A ripple of murmurs spread through the officers standing nearby. Some lowered their heads. Others exchanged anxious glances. Daniels stiffened, his hands clenched into tight fists, his chest rising and falling with anger. You can't do this. His voice trembled, caught between outrage and disbelief. I've served here for years. I can't just be cast aside over a stupid misunderstanding. Richard crossed his arms, his gaze cutting straight into Daniels' core. You call this a misunderstanding? No, Daniels. This is a consequence. Daniels opened his mouth to protest, but Richard raised a hand, cutting him off. From now on, every member of this force will be held accountable for their actions. If someone isn't willing to change, then they have no place here. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of 1,000 truths. The officers around them remained silent, because they knew Richard Nelson wasn't the kind of leader who made empty threats. Daniels shook his head, letting out a bitter, hollow laugh. So this is how you plan to run this station? By getting rid of people like me? Richard took another step closer, standing right in front of Daniels, his gaze unwavering. No, Daniels. I don't want to get rid of anyone. He paused, his voice lowering slightly. I want them to change. But if they can't, Richard tilted his head, his voice turning ice cold. Then they should walk out on their own. A deadly silence settled over the room. Daniels looked around as if searching for support from his colleagues. But no one spoke. Some even avoided his gaze. For the first time in his career, Daniels felt alone. Richard watched the team's reaction. He knew this was just the beginning. But if change was to happen, there would have to be casualties, or they would have to make their own choices. Think carefully, Daniels. His voice was low but commanding. You can choose to change, or that door is always open for you to leave. Daniels gritted his teeth. The entire room waited for his decision. And this would not be the last time someone was forced to make such a choice. Time passed, and the atmosphere in the police station gradually began to change. Some officers, initially hesitant, started adjusting their behavior. They realized that Richard Nelson was not just another chief passing through. He genuinely wanted to rebuild this place from its old, decaying foundations. But not everyone was willing to embrace change. Those accustomed to the old ways' indifference, abuse of power, still found ways to resist. They whispered behind Richard's back, watching him with skepticism or even hostility. Among them was Officer Reyes, a young man with conflicted eyes. Over the years, he had witnessed countless wrongs. He had seen officers like Daniels abuse their power, seen cases buried, seen the weak trampled upon. But he had never dared to speak up. That night, Reyes stood outside Richard's office, hesitating for a long moment before knocking. Officer Reyes? Richard looked up, his gaze probing. Reyes took a deep breath before speaking firmly. I need to talk to you. Richard nodded, motioning for him to sit. Reyes clenched his hands, eyes fixed on the floor, as if carefully choosing his words. I've been silent. Out of fear. Out of thinking that nothing I did would change anything. Reyes swallowed hard. But now I realize that silence is the problem. If I do nothing, I'm no different from Daniels. Richard studied him for a long moment before slowly nodding. So what do you want to do? Reyes clenched his fists tighter, his gaze resolute. I want to make things right. And if you'll let me, I want to help you change this station. A faint smile crossed Richard's face. Every change starts with a choice. He stood up, giving Reyes a firm pat on the shoulder. You made the right one. But not everyone did. While Reyes sought redemption, Daniels took the opposite path. He appealed his suspension, desperately trying to salvage his reputation. But as the internal investigation unfolded, long-buried truths came to light. Falsified reports. Citizen complaints ignored. Cases Daniels had tampered with. Times he had abused his authority to threaten, to cover up mistakes. All of it was slowly exposed. When the final report was released, Daniels had no way out. Not only was his appeal denied, he was permanently dismissed from the police force. The day he left, no one came to say goodbye. The colleagues who once stood by his side only watched in silence, none daring to step forward. Reyes stood in the hallway, watching as Daniels dragged his bag out of the station. For the first time, Reyes felt no fear, because he knew this was the path they had to take. And change, painful, difficult, had truly begun. One late afternoon, the golden sunset stretched across the small street, painting the rooftops and sidewalks cracked by time. Richard Nelson walked slowly along the road leading to the old residential area. He was not in uniform, just wearing a simple dress shirt, yet his presence was enough to draw curious glances. For the first time in years, the city's police chief was not sitting in his office. He wanted to listen. He wanted to look directly at the people his force was meant to protect, people who had long lost their trust in the police. At the street corner, a group of children played basketball. Their laughter echoed in the air, but as Richard approached, some of them hesitated, instinctively stepping back. He recognized the wariness in their eyes, of fear that had settled deep, not over a day or a month, but through years of injustice and cold indifference from those in uniform. A boy, around 12 years old, stood still, staring at Richard. His eyes were bright, but filled with doubt. Richard bent down, picking up the ball that had rolled to his feet, then gently passed it back to the boy. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jamal," the boy replied, but did not move closer. Richard smiled. "Do you like basketball?" Jamal nodded, still keeping his distance. He studied Richard for a long moment before speaking. "You're just like the other cops, always saying you'll help, but in the end, you just cause trouble." The words did not surprise Richard. He knew Jamal was not the only one who felt that way. But instead of denying it, he nodded. "I understand why you feel that way, and I don't blame you for it." Jamal narrowed his eyes. "Then why are you here?" Richard knelt down to the boy's eye level, his gaze sincere. "I'm here to change that. Not with words, but with actions." Jamal remained silent. The other children also watched, listening. A light breeze swept past, rustling the dry leaves on the sidewalk. Richard looked straight into the boy's eyes, his voice calm, yet resolute. "I can't change the past, but I can promise you this. From now on, this police department will try to do better. We will protect you, not make you afraid." Jamal did not respond immediately. He bit his lip, then gave a small nod. It wasn't a nod of full trust, but at the very least, it was a beginning. Richard stood up, giving the boy a light pat on the shoulder before walking away. On his way back to the station, he knew that promises would mean nothing without action. But that was why he was here. To do what was right, no matter how difficult it would be. That a year had passed, and the city had begun to feel the change. Not through grand slogans or lofty speeches, but through real actions. In the past, stepping into the police station meant feeling a heavy atmosphere, cold stares, dry words laden with pressure. But now, that had changed. New officers no longer followed outdated and toxic habits. They saw their leaders, people like Reyes, stand up for justice rather than turning a blind eye. In the main meeting room, Richard Nelson stood silently, looking around. A year ago, this room had fallen into silence when he first stepped up to introduce himself. Today, it was silent again, but this time, because everyone was listening. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice deep and strong. "But we're not finished yet." The officers in the room no longer looked at him with doubt. They nodded, not because they had to, but because they understood, because they had seen the change happen before their own eyes. Reyes sat in the front row, his gaze steadier than ever. A year ago, he had been a young officer afraid to speak up against injustice. Now he was part of the change, a role model for the younger officers. Of course, there were still those who resisted, still hidden forces that did not want to see this transformation. But Richard had accepted that long ago. He knew there would never be a perfect world, but what mattered was to keep fighting. As the meeting ended, people stood up. Richard stepped outside, taking a deep breath. The air felt fresher, or perhaps that was just how he felt. In the distance, on the street where he had once made a promise to young Jamal, the laughter of children echoed. He wondered if Jamal still remembered his promise. Whatever the answer was, Richard knew he would keep trying. Not just for Jamal, but for an entire future generation, one that deserved to live in a city that was safe, just, and full of hope. Richard allowed himself a small smile. His work was far from over, but at the very least, he had created a new beginning.